Very good. So what we basically going to see today, and that's what I think is the best modality, since we look at the Vatican museums in sections, we look at everything in the Vatican museums between the Pinacoteca and the Raphael rooms, which will be next week's pilgrimage. So as always, we have to fly over the pond. Our flight, the beginning of the week was very good. Even our 1-year-old actually made it surprisingly well, but we could play with him on the on the floor and all of that. So since the airplane was mostly empty, that was actually quite easy. It's this time is a great time to travel, so we took advantage of that.
Jan, I have a question. What did you experience when you entered Fiumicino, in the airport there in Rome? Did you have to go through temperature checks? What did you experience?
It was actually nothing. It was the check-in in the States was actually easier than the check-in when we flew to the States. So they just checked our marriage certificate when my wife's American, and then that was sufficient. Everything was on time when we arrived here in Rome in Fiumicino. There was no temperature check. No, not that I recall. We went through customs without a line. And they checked obviously all of the papers, but there were no additional. You have to fill out a form, so you have to fill out a form attesting that you don't suffer of the virus, and then you just have to hand that in basically, and that's it. And we were picked up by a friend because we had lots of suitcases. So it was actually really smooth, and the flight was half an hour early too. So overall, I really cannot complain. It went really well.
Well, I'm glad that you had travel without incident. That is good. Always good.
It is indeed. So that's the best way to start the week too. Very good. So we're joining. Well, we're going into the Vatican. So as you can see here, the Vatican is a small city-state. We all know this, and most importantly, we're going to visit the Vatican Museum, which makes up a huge chunk of the Vatican, right? Kind of area-wise. So the entrance of the Vatican Museum is on the very top there, and that's where we're going to enter. That's one of the beautiful street signs. Oftentimes it is, you can see these all over Rome, obviously for the streets, and the Vatican Museum, since they're so famous, they have their own street sign as well.
This is a plaque that you would see on the wall of the Vatican, directing the many pilgrims and tourists to the entrance of the Vatican Museum. And we talk about, if you've joined us before, the lines for the Vatican Museum. And as Jan pointed out when I showed him this photo, he's like, but Deb, you didn't even capture the point around the corner where you actually get to the entry. So this is the line before you even turn the corner to get on the same street as the Vatican Museum. And this is very typical from spring to I would say April to October. This is very typical.
Yes.
On peak days in the Vatican Museum, it's 30,000.
I can attest to that. There's only one line that is worse than the Vatican Museums, which is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Otherwise, the Vatican Museum line has, in my experience of 15 years in Rome, been always the worst. Deb, do you want to explain this, or should I give a little intro here?
Go ahead and give that intro here.
Yeah, so last week we visited the Vatican Picture Gallery, the so-called Pinacoteca. So you can see that on the left side, right, the little building that's kind of standing on its own. Today we're going to go through the main hallways and the main papal collections. So you can see here the Pinecone Courtyard is pointed out, and so we're going to basically walk through that courtyard from the entrance, and then we're going to walk around that courtyard in the adjacent hallways that are kind of walled in. And you can see it's basically a gigantic rectangle. So we will walk down the front side, so the closer side of that rectangle from the courtyard to the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, if you look at this picture, is on the far right bottom corner. It's pointed out, Sistine Chapel, and you can barely see the roof. And so this picture is taken from the dome of St. Peter's from the very top, meaning that it also allows you to see that the Sistine Chapel is comfortably couched between the museum and St. Peter's Basilica. So, so that's our itinerary for today. As a little bit of a trivia, one of my students that we walked into the Vatican Museums with had like a step counter on her watch, and she said that the whole tour that we actually took was 1.6 miles. So you have to walk 1.6 miles from the entrance to the exit of the Vatican Museums as the quote-unquote normal itinerary. Normal here means you skip most of the extra exhibitions that the Vatican Museums also host, such as the Egyptian collection, the Etruscan collection, the Carriage Museum, the Stamp Museum, the Coin Museum, the Early Christian Museum, the Ethnic Museum, the Papal, the kind of the souvenir museum part. So there is still a lot that you can see, even if you and
I would even add that the structure itself is a museum. You have the Bramante staircase, you have, which is closed to the public, you have Niccolini Chapel, which is a beautiful chapel of the Pope, which has a window in it, which is also closed to the public, where the horses would come through that window. So the structure itself in many areas is a museum.
Very, very, very well said. So here you go. Again, you can see the Vatican from a different angle. So the Vatican Museums on the right, that long rectangle, you can see the art gallery straight up. You can see the Sistine Chapel now in the full roof. And you can see that if you stood on St. Peter's Square, you could see the Sistine Chapel roof, right, where the white smoke comes out. So you can see the chimney as well. And then obviously St. Peter's Basilica, which is kind of dominating in this picture. Good. As last time, we passed by the exit and we're going to go through the new modern entrance. Dome of St. Peter's Basilica, we wave to that. And Michelangelo has left us that beautiful legacy. And we can see on the floor plan now our itinerary for today. So utilizing the numbers, or maybe I don't even have to utilize those, we're going to start on the left, large courtyard. Okay. What's on the right courtyard, I'm not going to tell you till the very end, and maybe you'll be a little bit surprised. But we're going to walk over that big courtyard on the left, go up into that hallway, take a left, and then go around to go through that very long hallway to the Sistine Chapel on the right bottom. These are all of the sections of the Vatican Museums. So as you can imagine, even if you were there in person, it is actually very hard to see everything. So I also don't feel so bad to just show you a selection of things. I have once had very, very, very enthused clients there, an older couple. So they were like in their 60s. And they said, we want to see everything. And I told them, I said, you do not want to see everything. And they said, no, we want to see everything. So I start showing them everything. And so after 6.5 hours, I believe they gave up, and we had to have a break and coffee. And they said, okay, maybe we're just going to go to the Sistine Chapel now. And I was like,
It can be a bit overwhelming, the Vatican Museum. It's unlike any other museum in the world. It really is. It's just so much. Just, I think, Jan, to orient people, again, I'm going to use the numbers because I think it's going to help. I even know the Vatican Museum, and I have trouble sometimes following. Number 28 is the courtyard we're first going to start in. And then we're going to be looking down hallway 26. And then we're going to take a left and go towards the room number 11 and go into those small galleries around that area. Then we come back and we go around down this very long hallway, which you will see 63, 62, 61, all the way down to 56, which is the map. For those who know the Vatican Museum, that is the hallway of the maps. And then, of course, 48, we're walking all the way to the right to 48 to the Sistine Chapel. We won't get there today. You can join us in 2 weeks for that. So that is our path for today.
As I always point out, it is not uncommon to put the Sistine Chapel towards the end of the tour. So, leaving everyone in there expecting kind of tension. that's also how the normal tour just proceed. We would not see the Sistine Chapel till the very end of the tour. So it's very fitting that I make you all wait. All right. So I think we can start here officially now with a breath of fresh air in the Pinecone Courtyard. And it's always very nice after the Pinacoteca, which is all inside, as you saw last time, to actually step outside and to go into the open. Right now, the Cortile della Pigna, that is called in Italian, today is empty and it's just kind of composed of grass patches and a couple of larger things that the museum direction put up. What you have to understand is that this courtyard is really and truly the center of the Vatican museums when, for example, Raphael lived there. You may not know this, but Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others did not just work for the Pope, but they also lodged with the Pope. Now, the Vatican Museums is composed partly of papal, so-called papal palace, so papal, like a papal house, and part it is actually built as a museum. And so the modern construction is kind of a mixture of both. I always like to point out which was actually part of the papal palace. And so this courtyard was part of the papal palace. This courtyard actually goes back to the Middle Ages. So to one of the first popes that was housed in the Vatican, which was Pope Nicholas III. He kind of started everything, started the construction of the Vatican. We're talking about the year 1277. And from that year on, every pope added something on to the Vatican museums. And that's what's so special is that we literally, by going into the Raphael rooms, for example, by going into the Sistine Chapel, we go into the house where the Pope used to live, okay? Which I think is very special. I mean, you know, it's like taking a tour of Versailles in France, and you actually go to the bedroom of King Louis XIV, which I always thought is cool, right? You see everything from the inside. So this courtyard is telling us that story. It's telling us the story of the papal collections. And this is something that I want to kind of emphasize today, or emphasize as one element when we look at all of the arts in the Vatican Museum, is that all of the popes contributed with their own personal money into this collection. So every pope of the Renaissance, and we call them, right, Renaissance popes, they were all nobles, and they came from all over. They came from Venice, they came from Florence, they came from Milan, they came from smaller cities, even smaller cities that you wouldn't even know, or they come from Rome. But they oftentimes come from nobility, because noble families can enable their children to have good education. They have the money to pay for tutors. They can learn Latin, they can learn Greek, they can learn diplomacy, they can learn economy, okay, economics, what today we would just probably call like a master's in economics, which you would need in order to run something like the Vatican. And then they would be pope and then contribute with their own family money. And this is something that's very cool. People like Julius II, right, who's of the Rovere family, as we mentioned last tour, he would use his own personal money, his own personal like inheritance and share of the family's riches to pay artists and also to pay excavations in Rome. And that's how we would get all of these statues. Now, the Pope was obviously landlord in Rome. Rome belonged to the Pope, to the Papal State, so it was his land. But the excavations didn't just happen automatically. The Pope had to go out of his way and make that happen. And so what many artists, Michelangelo would be a good example, what they actually did, what they occupied themselves with, was digging in the ground. Okay, actually digging in the ground. Michelangelo is attributed to have found specific statues himself personally. Now, obviously, Michelangelo is a good example because Michelangelo was a sculptor, so he had no problem taking a hammer, taking a chisel, and going into a quarry of marble and just hacking gigantic pieces of rock out of the wall. Something that we don't really identify with, artists. Artists always seem like very fragile people, right? But he was used to that. So he said, yeah, sure, I'm going to take a shovel and start digging in the Forum. Of course I'll do that. So he started digging, and they found all kinds of stuff. And so that's what they brought to the Pope. Now, why the Pope was interested in this, I will talk more about during the tour. But I just wanted to give you that kind of introduction. On this specific courtyard, people like Raphael and Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, they would be close friends, and they would talk with one another during their time in the Vatican. They would walk, and they would walk, having an after lunch kind of stroll, and they would walk through this courtyard. But there was not grass here, but what was out here was all of the statues that we're about to see on the tour today. They were not in the hallways. The hallways were needed for people to walk through. So the statues, while some of them were in storage and still are in storage, they would be put out here. So Raphael and Da Vinci would be able to walk through this gigantic, we could even call it like a forest of marble statues to learn and to admire the ancient classics. And this is something that will ultimately trigger the Renaissance. Now, we will also speak about the Renaissance later on today, but specifically on this courtyard, I think this is something important to figure out. So even for Raphael, going to the Vatican museums, living in the Vatican museums, meant to take a tour of the past, to look back to the old masters and to compare what they did with what he did, okay, or what he was doing. So what we can see here, and there are some things that we can easily point out, is that gigantic globe in the center, that is the so-called sphere within a sphere by Arnoldo Pomodoro, which is dated in the 90s, I think, 1990. And so that sphere is actually a modern piece of modern art that was given by Pomodoro to the Pope. And I think it was John Paul II at that point, and I can just see John Paul II looking at that, be like, well, okay, what am I going to do with this? And so he put it in the middle of this big courtyard, right? It's actually very neat. If I could, then I would step in and cross the railing and actually move it, because that sphere actually does turn on its own axis, which is just a neat little thing, and you're allowed to move it. So, but people always freak out when you go over the little chain, but you're allowed to move it. It's movable. And then on the left side, I'll show you something as well, which is the face of Augustus. So here it is located on the far left side. So we can also take a look at that. All right, when we move on, Deborah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we're first going to highlight the tower.
Pardon me. Of course we will. So on the right side here is the Tower of the Winds. And the Tower of the Winds I found fascinating, because the Tower of the Winds, specifically that little balcony that is in front of it, is where Da Vinci had set up his astronomical research material. So all of the telescopes, all of the calculation equipment was in there when he lived in the Vatican, and that would be his workplace. Now, you all are familiar with Leonardo da Vinci. I hope your knowledge of Da Vinci goes a little bit further than Dan Brown's mostly fictional account of what he did and his life's work. But Da Vinci obviously was a central figure of the Renaissance, and was not just that, but was also a universal Renaissance man, a universally knowledgeable Renaissance man. Da Vinci wrote on every subject: medicine, science, physics, art, geometry, geography, astronomy, everything, just everything. And so many of his, we have his writings, obviously. So you can look at Da Vinci from many different perspectives. But one of the things that is interesting in Da Vinci proper is how all of his knowledge actually informed his painting career. Now, we're not going to look at paintings today of Da Vinci, but this is just a general note that I think is worthwhile. And Deborah, I think you had an interesting story about this tower as well.
Well, this light on the floor is very significant. It's I believe it's the equinox. It's a certain time. So this is they use this in the time, but this is a private room. I was allowed to go in at one time, and we were told that this is where the Queen of Sweden converted when she converted. So I don't remember the entire story, but it's a very significant room.
The Christina of Sweden is one of the women that is also buried in St. Peter's Basilica. I think we've pointed her out during our tour, but I always like to remind people of that. So there are 3 women buried in St. Peter's. She's one of them. And what is more impressive is that Alexander VII, after she converted, she came to Rome, as you rightly said. She was received by the Pope, and the Pope basically built Piazza del Popolo for her, which was the gate of Nero to the city, and to properly welcome the church, welcome the queen, welcome a queen. He kind of refurbished everything, renovated the arch, and let her come in that way, and then she was led to the Vatican. So,
which was the way of the pilgrim? That was the way of the pilgrim. That was north. That was the entrance into the city from the pilgrim. Ah,
yes, okay. That's right. Which would make sense, right? If you convert, you're a pilgrim. We are on pilgrimage, so we all strive for conversion, and so that's it's just natural that you would. So, this is the namesake of this very courtyard. You ask yourself, well, why is this courtyard named Pinecone Courtyard? And the reason for that is the gigantic pine cone that is underneath this beautiful semicircular structure, which Bernini actually built and added to this wall. Now, this pine cone was placed in front of the Pantheon in Rome, and was basically, you may not believe this, a fountain. So all of the spikes of the pinecone have little holes in them, and the Romans could pump water through it. So if you would see this in action in front of the Pantheon when it was still standing there in the 3rd century, then it would actually have water coming out. So the whole courtyard, since it is so well preserved and such a beautiful piece of art, and you can see it's massive, compared with the people around it, the whole courtyard was dedicated to this pine cone. Also, the pine cone, like the peacocks, are a symbol of eternal life. So, for the ancient Romans, this was just a significant kind of symbol, right? The different layers of life. If you don't mind, we can go back one step, one image, because in the other image you can also see the lions, the Egyptian lions, on the floor in front of the pine cone. If we just go back for a second, and those lines are very significant because I think the next one. One more. Yeah, because those lines left and right remind us, and these are real Egyptian lions. The lions remind us that the Vatican had the first Egyptian museum in the world. So today you would identify the Egyptian museum with the Louvre in Paris. That's because Napoleon, when he came with his infamous shopping list and sacked Rome, he took most of the stuff that the Pope owned and brought it to the Louvre, especially because he loved Egypt, the Egyptian Museum. So the Egyptian Museum was actually not founded by Napoleon, but was actually the Vatican collection. And so even today, there is a large section, I wouldn't say it's overly gigantic, but there's a large section of the Vatican dedicated to Egypt. And here I think we can mention one. Well, actually, no. Let's go further. Let's go a little bit further, and then I'll come to a general. Now, this is the center, as I talked about, the bronze sphere within a sphere. For those of you who get the reference, I always like to call this the Death Star of Star Wars. And yes, it does turn, so you can turn it. And apparently, Arnoldo Pomodoro wanted to show the collaboration of technology and nature. So whatever that interpretation may be. That's the sphere. It's a piece of modern art. It also reminds us that the Vatican does have a huge modern art section, which we're not going to visit, but it is quite big, and there is people like Salvador Dali are represented there, or Francis Bacon, as well as what's the other famous? Matisse. Actually, the Vatican has a whole room dedicated to Matisse, the French painter of the 20th century. So that's always cool and sometimes surprises people. All right, maybe you're not really familiar with Emperor Augustus. He is the first. I'm a big fanboy of Emperor Augustus. Okay, he was really the man. He was the successor of Julius Caesar, and he was the first emperor proclaiming the empire of Rome. Why do I point him out? First of all, because it's a monumental statue, which means that holds that face belongs to an actual statue, like a whole body statue that was standing up, and which means that you can imagine how big that would have been. The statue is about, in my head, per meters, but it's about 25 feet, very, very large, about 90 feet, we guess. And we have other parts, other body parts of the statue in Rome. But why is Emperor Augustus so important for us Christians? Emperor Augustus is so important for us because under Emperor Augustus, for the first and kind of really the only time in Roman history, Rome could experience about 30 years of peace, the so-called Pax Augusta, the peace of Augustus, or the golden era. And during that time, Christianity was spread all over the Mediterranean. Had Augustus, and remember in every Christmas story, on every Christmas you remember his name in the Christmas story because it happened under Emperor Augustus, right? If Emperor Augustus had not done what he did, then Christianity may have not spread as quickly as it did. Not because people weren't convinced of the message and didn't want to hear the good news, but because there would have been infights in the Roman Empire, and you couldn't travel. You wouldn't have been able to travel safely like it was under Caesar. You wouldn't have been able to kind of seafare safely like it was under Caesar, and Christians couldn't have spread. But because of this beautiful decades of peace, Christians and Romans, for that matter, could really think beyond. Could really think, not just about their daily survival, but also about, well, what's going to be there after death and all of that. So Christians came just in the right moment. And that's also, divine perspective, from Jesus' perspective, that's a great time to come incarnate, right? Because he would see that that this time in world history allows him to spread the good news. So Augustus kind of like, even though he was a pagan, reminds us of this beautiful peace that the Romans established in their empire. Very good. So when we move on, we go into one of the hallways. And here I think you can look down the hallway of the statues. And so we have a collection of Roman and Greek statues. The Roman ones are the ones that look a little bit more realistic. The Greek ones are the ones that look a little bit more stylized. We don't have to go into detail into that. But what I do want to mention, or maybe a question that you ask yourself, is, well, why did the Pope or the cardinals, why did they take so much interest into ancient art? Because it's mentally pagan. And here we come, and this is, I think, what's important to say, here we come to a very important feature of the Christian faith. A core feature of the Christian faith, an essential feature of the Christian faith. Christianity knows itself to be true, which means and implies that everything that came before Christianity prepared man for Christianity, prepared man for the coming of Jesus Christ. And obviously, from a Christian perspective, it's very easy. We look at the Old Testament and we say, of course, there was something before Christianity that prepared man for the coming of God. That's the Old Testament. That's the story of the prophets. That's the covenant with Noah. That's the covenant with Abraham. That's Moses. All of that leads up to Christ. And you're quite right. But Christianity goes one more step further than Judaism. After the incarnation, we can really see how even, if you will, on a natural basis, the mind of man was prepared for the Christian message. And so Christianity was always open to that which preceded it, because it knew that somehow even this paganism was already part of it, of that story of God, of that story of the covenant, the story, the wrestling between God and man, the wrestling for truth. And this is a feature that is not supposed to be underestimated. And it does go into art as well. Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, he paints pagan muses. He paints Old Testament prophets. Why? For this reason, for the same reason that the Pope collected ancient statues, because they knew, well, mankind can achieve great things, but with God, with grace, mankind can even achieve, or can achieve even greater things. And so the Pope was not just like a pagan in fancy liturgical dress that didn't really care about the Christian message and just collected a bunch of pagan statues, I don't know, like busts of emperors and poets and imperial women. But the Pope knew greatness in nature will be met by grace. And I think this is kind of the best framework of looking at these papal collections, especially when you walk through this Chiaramonti Museum, so through the collection of ancient statues. I think this is the best way of understanding why the Pope took so much interest in it. And this is something that is particular to Christianity. Not Buddhism that has this understanding of the world, not Judaism has this understanding of the world, not Islam has this understanding of the world. Sometimes it's quite the opposite, right? Think of the Library of Alexandria. It's not, for Christians, it is no problem accepting something that is pagan, that predates Christianity, because Christians would always understand that to be building up towards Christianity. So I just like to point that out. That's kind of a framework that I like to use when I look at these collections. So I picked out a couple of famous statues of this collection. So here you can see the Roman side, which is the one that is further away, and then the Greek side, which is the side we are standing on. And so you just have a bunch of ancient busts. So some of the more famous people that we have represented here is Caesar Augustus. Okay, this is Caesar, so Caesar proper. Now Julius Caesar. Now, what is a little bit confusing, and I grant you that, is that all emperors had the title Caesar and Augustus, but we don't usually call them that. We call them that by their proper names. Okay, so Domitian, for example, is Domitian, but he's also Caesar and he's also an Augustus. What is the title? Augustus means the ever-growing, the ever-increasing. So Caesar, Julius Caesar of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was also an Augustus, but he was not the Augustus that I just spoke about. So this is Julius Caesar, and is most likely has a different nose, okay, than what the original would have been. You can see that the nose is chopped off. And here we can see a detail that I think is worthwhile pointing out, because we are actually confronted with the pagan idea of eternity in the statue. One thing that makes Roman statues different than Greek statues is that Roman statues are always true to the original physiognomy of the person represented. Greek statues, not so much. After the 4th century BC, definitely, 2nd century even stronger, BC, Greek statues look all the same. And I'm vastly generalizing here, but they really do. Like, if you look at them, like, they all have the same nose, they all have the same eye line, they all have the same forehead, they all have the same chin, and then sometimes they are distinguished by like iconographic features such as like a helmet or a dress or something like that. But most of them tend to look the same. The reason for that is that the Greeks made statues in order to find ideal beauty, and they like to idealize stuff. So if you see a bust of like Pericles, for example, the Greek king, most likely he will just look like this perfect kind of face you know, because the king has to be perfect. So they kind of, they gave him a facelift in stone. It's very different with Roman statues. So as we can see here, you know, Caesar has wrinkles. Okay, he has a fleeing forehead, which this one is very friendly with that. Is very clement. But he has wrinkles. He is not completely symmetrical, right? He sometimes later you see statues of Cicero. He has like a double chin or something like that. And the Romans would actually put that in statue in marble. And you ask yourself, and you say, why on earth did the sculptor not leave that out? Like, what? Just give him a facelift. Like, you don't need to see the double chin in the statue, right? You can just idealize a little bit. And Romans were very particular for saying, no, we will have all kind of biological mistakes, physiological mistakes also in the statue. Because, why? Because they said you only live eternally if you are eternally remembered. And here we have a clear understanding that goes completely contrary to the Christian belief of eternity. Eternity, so the soul, the incorruptible soul, we believe as Christians exists no matter if someone remembers you or not. Because God remembers you. There's always someone. If it's just one person, it's going to be God. Maybe they're also your parents. Maybe they're your children. But maybe not. Maybe your parents, I don't know, forgot you, or, never met you because you were separated at birth or something like that. And then they forgot completely about you, which is, I guess that would be kind of hard to say, make that case. But anyways, you understand the point. So, but for Romans, you only lived eternally if someone remembers you. And what's fascinating about this, that many of the statues are severed at the neck, okay, just like this one here. And this is not a coincidence. And you can look through that long hallway, right? The long hallway, and you go through, and it's like severed at the neck, severed at the neck, severed at the neck. They have sometimes complete hands, fingers, like the pink.
Jan, can you hear us? I think we may have lost Jan for a moment.
Can they hear you?
Mary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we'll give Jan a moment to come back.
So this is a reason to be cautious about Bitcoin.
So while we're waiting for Jan to come back on, I think he had to probably reboot his computer and come back on. Bob is also having trouble with his computer, so he's joined me in my office. And while we have a moment, I'd like for Bob to explain that light on the floor a little bit better than I did, because it's a very interesting story.
It looks like my computer has crashed completely, and I'm hoping it's not broken. Here's Jan.
Oh, Jan's back. Okay.
I am back. I am very sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I just got disconnected, and my Zoom just kind of stopped working. So I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you fine.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm sorry about that. So what I was mentioning was that the statues are severed at the neck. And so the key for that is that the Germans, so the Germanic tribes, so the Goths, the Vandals, right? Vandalism, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, all of those tribes that came through Rome, that started sacking Rome after the year 150, basically every 30 years, they knew about this understanding of the Romans, this understanding that you needed to be remembered in order to live on forever. And they said, well, we're not going to just destroy your monuments, but we're also going to destroy your memory, right? The deletion of memory, that's a technical term. The deletion of remembering the Romans. And so they just beheaded the statues. Clear and simple. They just beheaded them. They just took a baseball bat and just knocked it over. And they're pictures of that, actually. So paintings of that, recalling these incidents. So that's why many of these statues are actually severed at the head, which I always find is fascinating. Very good. Another famous... Oh, there's a comment here. That speaks volumes for today's destruction of statues. Yes, that's exactly what that is. That's exactly what that is. It is vandalism, right? So it's the Vandals that come in that sack, and the Vandals were not interested in keeping Roman culture. They were interested in what? What did the Vandals actually take? Gold. They took money, because money they could melt. So even if they didn't have the Roman coins, you could take precious metals, you could melt it and turn it into your own idols or turn it into your own currency. So this is a very good point. Yes, the destruction of statues always means the destruction of memory. What does ISIS do, right? Destroying Christian or pre-Christian statues. What is happening in Armenia right now, right? It's the destruction of Christian monuments, churches, and so forth. Because the hatred is so strong that the Vandals did not just want to sack Rome, they wanted to effectively delete Rome. Now, they didn't succeed, but that's what they attempted. Here's another famous statue, which is Cicero. This is an older Cicero. And there's another one actually in the Louvre, which I always have on my cell phone. And I show, it's a young Cicero, old Cicero, but the Romans are very good in capturing facial expressions. Fun fact, this is also the reason why we have no idea what, for example, St. Augustine of Hippo looked like, or St. Peter, or St. Benedict, but we do know exactly what Caesar looked like. Because the Christians did not take on this idea that you have to be perfectly precise in the representation of the physiognomy of saints like St. Peter or St. Augustine. Also, they probably didn't have the money and they didn't have the technical skill. So they just stylized them. And the oldest mosaic that we have of St. Augustine, which is in the Lateran, is just kind of looks like every Roman that would walk the street. You couldn't really distinguish them. Whereas Julius Caesar in your history book looks always like Julius Caesar. And Cicero, like here, always looks like Cicero. So very interesting, I thought. All right, so now we can move on. This is another one of Domitian. Now, this one is this is the emperor that saw the Colosseum finished. That's why I like to talk about him. And there's multiple statues of him in the Vatican. So many emperors are present, actually 2, 3, or 4 times. I think the most common is Hadrian, and Hadrian is like 18 statues of Hadrian in the Vatican. So it's just funny because you kind of look in every room, it's like, oh, there's Hadrian, oh, there's another Hadrian, oh, there's another Hadrian, all right, there's no, oh, hey, look, another Hadrian. So so that's always a great thing to point out. But Domitian is the one that he's the third emperor of the what are they called? The okay, now I forgot the family. The Flavians. There you go. Okay, the Flavians. My head just kind of sank in there. The Flavians, and so they built the Colosseum. So Domitian was the one that actually used the Colosseum. He wasn't the one that opened it, but he was the one that used all of the fancy equipment in the Colosseum for the first time. So he is always a good one to point out as well. By the way, if you are interested in the history of early emperors, I always suggest the contemporary to the emperor's author, Suetone or Suetonius. He wrote a book called The 12 Caesars, and I think that is about the first 12 Caesars, starting with Augustus, and that book is fascinating. And he'll go into crazy amounts of detail. I mean, we're talking about their daily routine, what they ate, their favorite color, their everything, okay? Everything about what you want to know. But it's not boring. It's very interesting. So Suetone, The 12 Caesars, if you ever are interested in that. All right. So one more person that I want to talk about, and this will link back to another important painting we'll see on today's tour, because this is Cornelius Scipio, or Scipione in Italian. So he has the title Africanus, and that's not because he's from Africa, but that is because he did the big conquest of Africa more precisely the big conquest of Carthage. After Hannibal with his elephants came to Rome, right, he lost the battle and he kind of had to turn around. Scipio was sent after Hannibal to raise Carthage to the ground, very famously. I have famous speeches about this that we still have and are still studied when you study Latin. So Scipio was successful. He defeated Hannibal, he razed Carthage to the ground, and very famously, he poured salt on the ground so that nothing would ever grow there again. Very theatrical. So Scipio was a very important Roman general. Why do I mention him? Because Scipio was the one to introduce horses into Roman warfare. Romans were very good at hand-to-hand combat, so infantry, but they didn't really have that notion of cavalry. And cavalry would be very, very important in another battle that we see on today's tour. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I just wanted to mention him. All right. So here we are on the Octagonal Courtyard, which is actually part of the Papal Palace. So this would be a place where Julius II, for example, would have walked and invited, artists and historians and philosophers to come together and to chat about antiquity. So today it's a collection of different works of art. You can see sarcophagi, right? So basically very fancy coffins. You can see bathtubs in the back, in between the colonnades. Those are bathtubs, Roman bathtubs. You can see mosaics on the wall, and you can see theater masks all around, as well as friezes. So there's a bunch here, but there's obviously important statues that are kept here. But I want to, before we move on to the statues, I want to mention one thing about the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is usually attributed to the Italians, which perfectly makes sense. But there is something else that caused the Renaissance. And I want to talk about that. That's one of the causes that is outside of Italy that actually made the Renaissance possible. First of all, we need to talk about what the Renaissance is. The Renaissance is the rebirth, renaissance, right? Rebirth of antiquity after the Middle Ages. Okay, so far so good. What is being reborn? The ancient arts, the ancient architecture, and ancient philosophy. All these three are reborn for the first time after the Middle Ages. Because Christianity was so established, it was so unquestionably dominating in the West as a political, as a religious power, and as a mental mindset, that Christians could actually go back in history and look at what was before them, and kind of talk about, well, what did the pagans think? What did the pagans believe in? Let's contrast that with what we believe. But that all was made possible by one very important invention. And so, these are the numbers from Paul Johnson, a very famous historian, who points out that in the 1400s, so 1400, how many books existed in Europe? And so the number he gives, which he says is a very, very generous estimate, is about 30,000. The largest library of that time was the library of the University of Cambridge, which could boost and kind of show off with the largest collection, which would be 6,000 volumes. That's a lot of books, okay? 1400. In 1490, 90 years later, how many books existed in Europe? 2.1 million. Okay, let that sink in. 30,000, 2.1 million. 90 years, that's 2 generations. So what happened? The printing press, right? Gutenberg in Strasbourg, who in the middle 1400s invented the printing press. I think it's 1429. The exact date I'm not sure of. And after that, what most large cities did most of the time was print books. Whereas before, the copying of books, of individual books, was in the hands of monks who had to spend years of their life copying texts. That's all they did sometimes. I mean, prayer, eating, sleeping, and copying books. Now that could be mechanized. And so all of the ancient philosophers that were brought over after the sack of Constantinople by the Ottomans, they were brought into the West, and then they were reprinted. So for the first time in history, you had many works of Aristotle accessible, many works of Plato, many works of Plotinus, the Neoplatonists, and so forth. And so the Pope obviously tried to get his hands on as many as he could. So it was great, great stuff, right? Not just the Aeneid and the Iliad, which you have already read 50 times, but actually new content, right? There were some novelties, like the internet, right? The invention of the internet. It's like, wow, now I can actually watch what I want when I want it. That's crazy. I can actually read Plato myself. I can read Aristotle myself. That was a new thing, okay? There was not just one volume that 50 monks had to share, but a pope could have his own library. All right, so that was one of the causes of the Renaissance, like historically and mentally speaking, right? It allowed the old texts, the old manuals to be read. And so I think this is a good place, a good courtyard to talk about this. All right, now let's talk about the statues that are actually present here. And the most famous, obviously, is the best preserved and most beautiful Greek original, which is the Laocoon, or Laekon, as sometimes is pronounced in English. Now, the Laocoon, you have incredible stories written about this. Deb, I kind of want to put you on the spot here. Do you actually know who that person was?
He was a father. Those are his sons.
That's correct, yes.
Troy?
Bob, you're cheating. I heard that. I
totally
heard
that.
That is totally not accepted.
I knew it was a father and his sons, but beyond no, I do not know.
Don't worry about it. Not many people do know. So it's really, that's why I told you I'm going to put you on the spot. Thanks, Bob. So, but again, you just answer that as a tag team. That's a good thing. So, Laocoon was very important for the Greeks because he was the chief priest of Troy. And so we see him in this moment of struggle, of death, more precisely, after he threw a spear against the Trojan horse that was brought into Troy. And he said, nothing that comes from the Athenians can be good. Very famous quote. And so Athena summons 2 sea serpents and kills off the chief priest of Troy. And so we see him innocent, that's why he's naked, and with his 2 children, with his 2 sons, as you correctly said, Deborah, very good, and being killed by those gigantic sea serpents that were summoned by Athena. And I mean, we can go on and on and on about the amazing detail, okay, the amazing workmanship, out of control workmanship of the sculptor. I mean, everything, toenails, muscles, veins, right? Pulsing veins in his arm, everything. I mean, the hair, okay? It's incredible. And look at it. Look at the details, right? Look at the intense amount of details. So Michelangelo praised this to be the most beautiful statue that he had seen, potentially one of the most beautiful statues that has ever been made, okay, by human hands. And he loved it. But it's not just the artistic workmanship that is impressive or that's important. The Laocoon was very, very important for the Romans as well. And you would say, well, what did the Romans have at stake at the battle of the Athenians against the Trojans? I mean, both of those cities, that battle was over when the Romans were around and had their empire. So why would they care? And there's a very important moment because Laocoon, when he was killed, everyone kind of stopped battling in Troy, right? Everyone looked up to the highest point of Troy, which was the temple, and in the kind of the courtyard of the temple, Laocoon was killed. Everyone looked up and kind of froze And that moment, we say, was the moment when Aeneas fled Troy. Now, the story of Aeneas is its own story. You can read that in the Aeneid. But why is it significant? Because Aeneas eventually will be the founder of a new city. And that new city is, you guessed it, Rome. So Rome, when you think about it, is actually Troy, is the new Troy. And that's what Emperor Nero always referred to when he spoke about Rome. He spoke about the new Troy, because he understood himself and his own family line to be directly blood related to Aeneas, the founder of Rome and the Trojan. That also meant that in the kind of Greek mythology and the wars that go on with the city-states in Greece, it was not the city of the thinkers, Athens, who won, but it was the city of the warriors with a strong bulwark, that with a strong defense that actually endured time. And Rome liked to think of itself as that. Now, there is a very famous Renaissance not reconstruction, but completion of the Laocoon, because as you can see, some of the body parts were severed, so the arm was severed, and so this was actually done by one of Michelangelo's students. Yeah, there you go. So so the arm was severed, and so they didn't know what it would look like. So we do have a reproduction of it, a kind of a recreation of one of Michelangelo's students who put on a new arm, and that arm was kind of stretched out, as you can see, and had the snake, was battling with the snake, right? And you have the arms and hands of the sons as well. The problem with this is, and was pointed out by art historians, is that this shoulder would actually have been dislocated. Okay, the muscles do not work like that. You cannot have that kind of exact movement. So ultimately, the arm was removed again, and a German. Actually, Jewish German art historian, when he was in Florence in 1904, and I forgot his name now. I think it was Winkler. But not. You can look this up though. He found an arm in a Florence art studio, and he said, "Is that an original?" And the shop owner said, "Yeah." And he says, "I think that's the Laocoon arm." So he brought it to Rome. He asked permission for at the Pope, and the Pope allowed it, and he brought the arm back, and it fit. So that was the original arm, and this was the original position, assuming that one of the snakes actually bit Laocoon in the neck, okay, also being like the death stroke. So you can see the difference here of the arm that is stretched out and the arm that is closer to the neck. Now you can also see that the arm is beaten up much more than the rest of the statue, and the reason for that is that it was just in some workshop, and no one really knew what it was. It was just a fragment, so no one really cared about it. But that seems to be the original arm. So very good. I think we can move on to another important statue, and this. Oh, okay. There was another beautiful detail of the face and the agony, right? And the German poet. Schelling actually wrote a whole book on the Laocoon. Okay, he just looks at it, and he wrote like a very long poem. It's like 20 pages long on the beauty of the statue. So that has been translated into English. So if you do wanna read it, then do it. Very good. Another famous statue that is opposite, next to the Laocoon, is the Apollo Belvedere, and the Apollo Belvedere is one of the most considered as one of the most perfect Greek statues, with a perfect build and a perfect execution. And most important is that Michelangelo used the face of the Apollo Belvedere as the face of his Christ in the final judgment in the Sistine Chapel. So that face and that a little bit elaborate hairdo, if you will, we will recounter in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. So as homework, please just remember the face, and I'll point it out then. One more statue is in this courtyard, which is interesting, and that is the statue of Perseus slaying the Medusa. And here we have a beautiful kind of close-up of that. And that statue is not ancient. That statue is done by a relatively, quote-unquote, recent Italian sculptor, and that is Antonio Canova. So that statue is just about 100 years old, a little bit more, 110. Well, okay, now we're in 2020, so it's 120 years old. That's late 19th century. So artists, even 100 years ago, still tried to emulate the classical canon. Moving further into the museums, we have this beautiful room that was compiled by Pope Pius VII, which is the room of the animals. And so Pius VII, for some reason, no, the sixth, sorry, not the seventh, the sixth. Pius VI had a strange fascination with marble animals. Okay, so I guess because he couldn't have a pet, he just had marble pets, and so he collected marble pets. So you have two rooms that look like this, that are just a bunch of geese, lions, jaguars, horses, unicorns, rams, bunnies, everything, cows, oxen, everything made of marble. So he just has this room of the animals, which is always cute. And I told Deborah the story before. There was just one rabbit that unfortunately there's no picture, and I never took a picture of it because I never thought I would need a picture of it. But there's a little bunny that looks like a little bunny, but he has just this extremely distorted face that looks very, very intensely evil. So I always call it like the little satanic bunny from hell, or the infernal bunny. But it's just really funny. Maybe I can find a photo sometime and show it to you in the next tour. Anyways, here we have another bunny that unfortunately fell prey to one of the forest centaurs. So again, another piece.
The statues in these rooms are just quite remarkable in detail, and you sometimes, most times, these rooms are not open. So when they're open, it's really a joy to go in, because you can just stand in front of one statue and wonder, just let your imagination go away. Like the bunny, there's just so many different images of animals in different situations that it's been a day just in these two rooms, really.
Yes, you could, especially if you're an animal lover. Anyways, so we move on through the room of the muses, and this is just an interesting room because this was built as museum, so this is not papal apartment. And this room is very interesting because it shows you that the collection was not just put together at random, but that every pope really thought about what the room would contain. And so on the ceiling, you see Apollo, okay, in a mosaic, you see Apollo, and then underneath you have everything that has to do with philosophy and with the arts, right? Apollo is the god of knowledge, or the god of truth, for the Greeks and for the Romans. So underneath you have the 9 muses, also the 9 women, along with philosophers' heads. So you have Homer, you have Socrates, you have Plotinus, you have Plato, if I remember correctly, you have Pericles, all of these kind of big shots of Greece, because they were compiled and kind of put together under the sign of Apollo. So also just a very beautiful sign that the popes needed to have some personal education in order to understand and to make understood what their collection consisted in. And then the next room is the room of the rotunda. Now here the floor, I think, is what's really impressive, and I'll show you some of the statues in a second, but the floor here is original 4th and 2nd century BC, okay, BC. So this floor is 2,200 years old, mosaic floor, which you can just walk on. Okay, I'm always looking at our floor, and I'm like, I don't know if people in 2,200 years will be able to walk on this floor. But back then, they built pretty good floors. So you have mosaic floors in black and white, which is from the 4th century BC, and chromatic, which is in color, from the 2nd century BC. And here we have another example, and this is what I want to show you, of the intricate detail of the Romans. This is Emperor Claudius, who is dedicating something. Okay, he's in the position of the chief priest with Apollo, the eagle, at his feet. So he's clearly doing something for the gods right now. And look at his face. Okay, and right next to him is a bust of him. Okay, look at his face. Now look at the bust. You move on to the bust.
Yes.
Same face. And you can see how you can recognize the people by really learning their facial features. This is something proper to Roman statues. Really impressive. Really impressive stuff. So, very good. We can move on to kind of the odd one out, which is Hercules. And Hercules is the odd one out because he is still in bronze. And you say, wow, okay, bronze statues, that's not something that I'm familiar with. Understandably, the Romans actually liked marble much better, but the Etruscans so the people that the civilization before that predated the Romans had metal statues. Why? Because you could actually have a form, and you can have multiple statues out of that one form, right? You press them, so you melt the metal, whatever it may be, and you put it in a form, and then you could just kind of print statues. So it was much easier to make than just making every marble statue by hand. And so this is one of the few originals from late antiquity, and that refers to the 4th century AD, late antiquity, that we have in the Vatican, which was not melted down by the Vandals, that was actually buried as an integral piece and then unearthed when in the 19th century the Roman Forum was excavated and put in the Vatican. So it's just a reminder that you don't just have marble statues, but you also have metal statues. We move on up the stairs, but before that we're going to look into the room of the Greek cross, and here we have something that I'm sure is very fascinating, which is the 2 sarcophagi left and right of Constantine's family. Constantine made a family to Helena, his mother, which is on the left, and yes, that is Saint Helena. And then the right was for his daughter Constantia. And so what is interesting about these is obviously that Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. So he was the first emperor that converted, that allowed Christianity to practice. And because of that, on the sarcophagus we have pagan imagery that has a Christian meaning. So when you look closer at that sarcophagus, that red marble sarcophagus, that's porphyry marble, when you look closer, you look at one of the details, you can see that there are little pudi, or little angels, right? Little angels pressing grapes. And that is something that a Roman would understand, because they made wine. They drank wine all the time. They drank wine for every meal of the day. I mean, heavily diluted, but nonetheless, they drank wine. Grape juice, right? Grape juice. So they drank wine, and so Constantine, since he converted, he said, okay, this is a great, what happens when we die? Well, we get crushed, but then something better comes out, right? Eternal life. We have this idea of eternal life again. So grapes from nature can be crushed, can be destroyed, right? Can die, and then will resurrect, quote unquote, as something better, as something with spirit, wink, wink, right? Wine. So for Constantine, this was the perfect image, and so for his daughter, he prepared this sarcophagus. Now, his daughter, neither Saint Helena nor his daughter were actually ever buried in there, but that's a different story. So this is the other side, Helena, which has a battle scene. You can see Helena on the right top. You can see her bust, and then some of the Roman soldiers on mounted horse, going into some battle. I actually don't know which battle this is, so. Probably against the Dacians. Constantine loved waging war at Dacia, which is today's Croatia. So, all right, we're going further into the hallways, and we're coming almost to the Raphael room. So there's just a couple of slides more. I think I'm over time again. Oh boy! So I do apologize, but we can. I think we have a little bit more time. If you just grab me 5 more minutes, then we can finish together. So this is one of the tapestries, the Resurrected Christ, and this is the next tapestry, which is obviously under good air conditioning because tapestries are fabric. So this is not painted, but this indeed is woven. What is very, very impressive is that if you had a tapestry, so I don't know what you have. Maybe in your house, in your apartment, you have like a very important vase, or you have like a really expensive glass, or you have like a really expensive painting, or I don't know, like a bookshelf that's antique or something like that, right? And you would probably give that like a pretty good positioning, so that whenever someone goes into your living room, you're like, oh man, you have a beautiful bookshelf, or beautiful vase, or beautiful glass, or beautiful whatever, right? So if you were a 15th century pope or 16th century pope, then you would do that with tapestry. Everyone had busts, everyone had paintings, everyone had mosaic. No one cared about those things, okay? But tapestry was uber fancy. Like the tapestry is like the Swarovski wall covering. It's like you want that. That's awesome because it was so incredibly expensive. Unbelievably expensive. Okay. So in the 16th century and then into the 17th century, really only kings like the Pope, the King of France, the King of England, the King of Poland could actually afford a tapestry. And if you had one tapestry, that's like, oh my gosh, it's like the Lamborghini. Okay, you show people that, you're like, oh man, I got a tapestry, and people would freak out because it is woven in silver and gold thread. It's made from silk, and it has to be hand woven. So it took 40 workers multiple weeks, or if not months, to make something of this sort. Now, this particular tapestry, why do I point it out? Because this is the tapestry that was most recently under display outside of the museums, and that was during the Second Vatican Council. These tapestries were hung up in St. Peter's Basilica between the columns above the Council Fathers. And if you look at photographs of the bishops and cardinals that meet in St. Peter's, you can see big tapestries hung up, and this is one of them. And I think in some photos you can actually make out the resurrected Christ. So that's why I wanted to point it out. The original use were actually insulation in the Sistine Chapel. So in the winter, they would keep in the heat, and in the summer, they would keep out the heat. So you'd hang those up on the Sistine Chapel walls, on the lower part.
Mm-hmm.
You can still see the hooks, actually. So anyway.
This also is famous. This is I want to say this is a long hall of tapestries. So as you're walking through those long corridors, you have two big halls, and that it would be, of course, the tapestry hall, where we have, as you line both sides of the hallways of the walls are lined as you walk down. And then you leave that hallway and you go into our next room, which is the hallway of the maps. This particular one is the one you will always have the most people crowded around. And the reason is as you walk by, Jesus follows you. So the stone coming out, the point of that stone, as he comes out, it follows you and it changes direction. So there's an optical illusion in this tapestry that a lot of artists have used in paintings as well. And so people are always, when they go into this room, because there's so many, this is the most famous. And one of the reasons is because of this optical illusion.
Yes.
Okay.
Now,
so
one of the questions was how old are these again? So the tapestries, all of these are from the 16th and 17th century. So I think this one is late 16th century. Yeah.
So now we move on to our next hallway, and you can see how long these hallways are. And this, of course, is the hallway of the maps, which is just a wonderful hallway to get lost in. And yes, I'll let you take it from here, Jan.
So this is the last hallway before we go to the Raphael rooms. This is the last monumental hallway, the largest collection of painted geographical maps in the world. It's about 120 meters long, which would be 360 feet. Oh gosh, I don't know that in yards. Probably 100 yards, right? Like more than 100 yards. So it's very, 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 very long and very beautiful. And it is ornamented on the left and the right by painted maps. And all of these painted maps are different parts of Italy. What is cool about it is that the maps are not painted according to orientation. So they're not painted according to north, east, south, and west, but they're painted as seen from Rome. So everything in the north is painted as seen from the south, and everything in the south is seen as painted from the north, because the center of Italy is the Pope. And the center of the Pope and the Papal Hallway is this hallway. So the Pope would walk through this hallway and seeing Italy unfolding around him. And I always love that, because he would say, well, I am the king here, I'm the boss, right? And so this is my land. This is my jam, right? So these are my you have the papal land, but then his power extends beyond that, and so he would be in the center of attention. So the Pope, before he goes into the Sistine Chapel at his morning mass, would be reminded of all of the souls he cares for, obviously in the world, but primarily in Italy. Right? So, so that's just a neat little feature. I think one of the things that is important to say about this hallway is that it was constructed under Gregory XIII, whose name was Ugo Boncompagni. And so this is, for example, the map of all of Italy, which are the two last maps, left and right. But Gregory XIII is very, very famous for something else. And as it so happens, on when they made the research for these maps, and an intense amount of research went into these paintings. One of the Dominican scholars, Ignazio Danti, he came to the Pope, to Pope Gregory XIII, and he said, Your Holiness, we do have a slight problem with the calendar, because he was in charge of the sundials, of the maps, and of the calendar, and he realized that actually the calendar was behind. And we're talking about the Julian calendar, so the calendar that was instituted by Julius Caesar, that the Pope still 1,400 years or 1,500 years later used. And so Ignazio then said, so how are we going to resolve this? And the Pope said, well, so what's exactly the problem? And the Dominican said, well, we are 1 week behind the stars. So we have to kind of catch up with the stars. How do we do this? And the Pope said, oh, no problem. So you went to bed on October 4th, 1581, and you woke up on October 11th, 1581. 1 week cut from history. And from that moment on, we have a new calendar, and that is the so-called Gregorian calendar. If you look to your wall, that calendar is a Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory XIII introduced the leap year in order to avoid this kind of delay 1,500 years later, right? And so from that moment on, we have the Gregorian calendar. As you know, the Eastern churches still use the Julian calendar, so they didn't accept that because it came from the Pope, so couldn't have been good, right? So so they're under the Julian calendar, and as you know, their Easter, for example, is still 1 week later than the Western Easter.
Most years it varies. So sometimes it's the same. Sometimes it's the same. We celebrate with the Orthodox Eastern.
You know, I just want to quibble a bit, because yesterday we had a pilgrimage with St. Teresa of Avila.
Nice, beautiful.
Now, in the biography, it says she died either on October 4th or on October 15th, because she either died just before midnight on October 4th or a few minutes later, the first minutes of October 15th. Now, that was 10 days that were taken out, but that was in Spain. So I think it was 10 days, Dr. Bentz.
Okay, good. That's very possible. Did she die in that year?
Yes.
Wow, that's really inconvenient for her. That's cool. All right.
and that room we saw at the beginning with
the tower
with the light slanting in, they used to calculate. They assisted this process of calculation, realizing that light was no longer hitting the very center of that circle. It was moving each year just that much off. And so they said, our calculation is not 365 and 1/4 days, but 365 and 1/8 days or something. And so over hundreds and hundreds of years, it became first 1 day, finally 10 days from Julius Caesar up until Pope Gregory, 1,500 years. And they changed.
Very nice. Yes, exactly. And that it was ultimately the sundials for Dante, who there were 4 in use in Rome. So, and he was in charge of all of them. So it may have been the Tower of the Winds, or probably a combination of them all, that made him realize, like, okay, something's off. But okay, so 10 days, not 7 days. Very good. Well, no matter what, the Pope changed time in that year, right? Which is something quite incredible. So this is the last map. This is all of Italy. Okay, and this is then where we will slowly come to an end. I still have one more beautiful. Yeah, so there's the map again. So this is the old and the new Italy. Now I have one more gigantic picture, and we spoke with Deborah about this. This is the victory of King John or Jan Sobieski, so King John III Sobieski, at Vienna, at the gates of Vienna, painted by the Polish Jan Matejko, which is just before you go into the Sistine Chapel or the Raphael rooms, depending on which way we take. We'll take the room of the we will take the way of the Raphael rooms naturally. But this is also, as I like to call it, the invention of Italian breakfast, because the Siege of Vienna, which is it's 1583, right?
No, 16.
1683. Okay, there you go. 1683. Thank you, Bob. It was obviously a monumental victory because the Muslims were stopped at the gates of Vienna. You have to understand that had that not happened, then we would all today go to mosques on Friday instead of going to church on Sunday. Right? So Jan Sobieski had the amazing idea of riding down the Kahlenberg, which is one of the mountains right outside of Vienna, because that was the only mountain that was said to be non-passable. Okay, they said that this just, no one can ride down that mountain. So that's why he said, okay, we got to get them exactly where they're not expecting us. So they're riding down with the largest cavalry charge in history. Okay, it was 18,000 hussars, which are the winged riders of the Poles. And you can see them here behind him with the big feathers on their back, mounted on their back. And you can say, okay, this is, they had a lot of swagger having all of these feathers on their back, but it was actually a tactical purpose, because the sound these feathers made would scare off all of the horses of the enemy that were not used to that sound. So that's why it was so important to have these feathers mounted on their back. Ultimately, that gigantic charge of cavalry led to the victory of the Christians against the Muslims. And that's why I mentioned Scipio Africanus before, because Scipio was the one that introduced cavalry, right? So that was the first cavalry charge, and here we come to the, last important cavalry charge that we know of.
Well, we passed this painting on to our next room before we end this week's tour inside the Vatican Museum, which is a very important room.
Yes, that room is the room of the Immaculate Conception. So we can move on there now. And this is also the newest restored room. So you do see it in its full glory with all of the gilding redone. Now, the room of the Immaculate Conception naturally recalls the dogma of the Immaculate Conception that was proclaimed in 1854 by Pius IX. Not to have this confused, nothing that any of you does, just making sure the Immaculate Conception does not refer to Jesus, but to Mary. Okay. I just have to make sure that we're on the same page there, because there's always a lot of confusion about that with some groups that I have. Not with this one, but it's still kind of ingrained in me to say this. So you see the Marian statue in the front that's mounted on a bookshelf, but in the back you can see the Pope actually proclaiming the dogma, and you can see the open heavens, right? So you have the Pope, and he's actually in St. Peter's Basilica. Behind it, you can see the chair of Bernini. Right behind that baldacchino, you can see the chair of Bernini, which is painted. So he's in St. Peter's Basilica proclaiming that dogma. You have a beautiful mid-19th century scene of a liturgical function. This is how they would dress. This is how they would behave. And the Romans were really, really not in favor, because it was obviously it was in December 8th, which is the feast of the Immaculate Conception, and so the weather wasn't as clement. It was a rainy, cloudy day, and so the Romans, always being a little bit superstitious, said, no, it's a rainy day, like this is not a good day to proclaim a dogma. And so the Pope said, no, we're gonna do this today. So he walked out, and you can see this ray of light coming through the ceiling, hitting the Pope, and he looks at that ray of light, and he looks and he says, see, this is God wants this, having the dogma, the text of the dogma in his hand. And so it was the good weather, the turn to good weather, the breaking of the clouds that convinced also the Romans that this would be a good idea. And so you have the Immaculate Conception obviously here in the middle. On top, the Virgin Mary is in the middle. In heaven, next to her is Jesus and God the Father. And then Peter and Paul, as we already know, those are always together. And everyone in heaven is rejoicing, everyone on earth is rejoicing. And so this wall painting beautifully captures that moment. Here's one of the close-ups. So you have John the Evangelist kind of looking out with his feather in hand, right? And then the other apostles next to him, and a bunch of angels as well. You always need to have angels. You just got to have angels. We love angels. Very good. So with that, we come.
I think it's important, though, this piece of furniture in the middle, because
Sure.
when you walk in this room, you walk around this piece of furniture, and what you have in there is the actual documents in the different languages.
Yes, that's right. And these documents actually are facsimiles. So they're not the original text, but they're an exact copy of the original text. I did check that with someone of the Vatican Museum, so presuming that he was right, you can see the books and the book covers, but then the actual texts are stored in the Vatican Archive, also to be able to be, so people can actually read them and check them if you're allowed to research in the Vatican Archive. And we come to a kind of anticlimactic end, because this is the counterpart to the courtyard of the Pinecone, which is the Belvedere courtyard. And even though it's called a beautiful view, it is actually the Vatican's parking lot. So also reminding us that the Vatican is still very much in use. It's not just a museum. You do have a need to have a courtyard where you park your car. So the the Vatican Firefighters are here. You can see the little fire truck down there, and then everyone who works in the Vatican, in the Secretariat of State or in the archives, has to come in here, or usually comes in here, parks the car, and then goes wherever they want. Now, Deborah, you wanted to point out some of the the entrances.
If you're looking straight ahead, down on the bottom right and the bottom left on the wall that's facing us, or the facade that's facing us, the bottom right is the Vatican Library. You can see the door. It has concrete around it, embellished. And then on the left is the Vatican Archives. If you look in the middle and you see the fountain, and you go directly to the right, you'll see an opening just in front of the fire truck. In order to go from this side of the Vatican, which is where they have the commissary, if you will, the grocery store, the post office, it's the living part of the city.
Beyond that arch.
And beyond that arch, you would come out there for those who are in Rome and know the St. Anne Gate, which is by the church right there. That is where you come out. So when you're facing St. Peter's Basilica, that entry is off to the right. But in order to go from one side of the Vatican to the other, you must go through this courtyard in your car. And you come out of that opening right in front of the fire truck. You go around, you just pass the fountain, and you go straight, and you go into the wall. You go into the building, and you drive up through like an interior tunnel. That it was really built for horse and carriages. And so that when we go through this way, when we stay inside the Vatican, sometimes on our pilgrimages, it's a very tight corners you have to turn there. It's the only way to go from one side of the Vatican to the other. And it's used quite a lot. And Jan is right. Right where you see the fire truck and the white car parked behind it, there's an entryway there. And that's where, if you worked in the Secretary of State's office, you go in those doors. Secretary of State's office is part of the Papal Palace. And so this is like the back door in, if you will. Of course, there's security everywhere. So you're passing through multiple security layers as you go through the Vatican City.
Yes, you don't just walk onto this courtyard. The photo where we take on this is actually you go a little bit outside, connecting the room of the Immaculate Conception to the Raphael rooms, and so you can look at it, but you cannot really just walk in there. You have to go through security. So good.